One Direction have sent thousands of their fans delirious this afternoon.
So to explain, BTS calls them their army. That means their fans.
It's a teen sensation invasion in Foxborough.
They can expect pure madness.
Well, think of them as the male counterpart of Hannah Montana.
These girls will all be waiting out here until then with their signs, and they were screaming. I think my ears have been bleeding for pretty much most of the morning.
Whether you grew up with the Monkees or the Jonas Brothers, Super Junior or EXO, New Kids on the Block or One Direction, you know what a boy band looks like and sounds like, how they dance or how they don't dance, what their fan base usually consists of, and who they're usually marketed to. But one question that's haunted me for quite some time is why? Why boy bands? What makes boy bands so popular, so powerful, and so influential? Is it just because teenage girls need someone or something to scream their puberty out to?
There's always got to be something for 12-year-old girls to scream their puberty out to.
Well, that's a blunt way of putting it, but yeah, kind of. But I'm getting ahead of myself.
You're just too good to be true. Can't take my eyes off you.
The modern concept of the boy band as we know it today, being a group of 4 to 5 male singers, either playing instruments or dancing and singing to catchy and cute songs for girls and young women to enjoy, was popularized, of course, by the Beatles. And though defined by their moppy heads of hair, skinny ties, and musical capabilities, what made the Beatles, and by extension what makes boy bands, are their fan base. Screaming teenage girls. As The Hollywood Reporter put it, the Liverpool quartet known as the Beatles were not only the quintessential rock band, but many considered John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr to be the original boy band, especially in the early 60s when young girls would scream at the top of their lungs and pass out upon first sight of the Fab Four. And though the Beatles would musically evolve into one of the world's largest rock bands and shed their suit and ties in the late 60s, they started out as a boy band and owe much of their success to filling a niche in the market that had not yet been fully tapped into, and of course the United States' hunger in the mid-60s for all things British. And from the blueprint that were the Beatles sprung this new concept for male musical acts, the boy band. There is a long history of boy bands and how each decade and musical era had their boy band, and how the concept of boy bands evolved and expanded to include choreographed dance numbers as well as other genres besides rock and pop. But I'm not going to get into that in this video because this is a commentary video and not a history lesson, but trust me, we've come a long way since the Beatles. Let me know what your favorite boy band is or was down in the comments below. What I will say is that I think that since the Beatles, boy bands have increasingly gained a bad reputation. When boy bands were first starting out and girls were losing their minds over them, it was seen as kind of a novelty and kind of odd, but they're fragile women and this is just a one-off thing, right? Beatlemania is going to fade out eventually, but it didn't. And with the popularity and influence that boy bands amassed, it was only natural that they became heavily scrutinized, sometimes rightfully so, for taking advantage of fans and preaching odd messages to their followers. But more often than not, it's because of what they seemingly stand for, either when it comes to the music industry or who their main demographic is. Many see them as cynical cash grabs and brainwashing teenage girls as if teenage girls can't think for themselves, or see them as not being real musicians simply because their fan base is mainly, again, teenage girls, and everything teen girls like is shitty, right? But a lot of the time, as we'll see in the video, members of boy bands don't actually have a lot of power and end up being preyed upon, overworked, and exploited, while also having to navigate these ridiculous expectations of being good role models while also still being kids themselves. And this is what this video is going to focus on: the power boy bands wield, how that power mainly comes from a female fan base, and how power can sometimes not be power at all.
I'm a little addicted to them. Right now I'm gonna go running. This is what I love. I love to do it every morning.
I get up, come downstairs, eat my breakfast, and then I'm always wanting to write a song.
So since this topic of boy bands is so huge, I'm only going to be really talking about 2 bands that I'm particularly interested in, mainly the Jonas Brothers and EXO, but I will also mention other notable examples along the way. So first, let's talk about the Jonas Brothers. The Jonas Brothers have reshaped their public image in recent years and have been able to take control of their band as adults, and I'm really happy for them. But do you all remember the Jonas Brothers like when they were first starting out, like even before Disney got to them? If you don't, the Jonas Brothers started out as a small rock pop band based in New Jersey. In 2006, they came out with their first album, It's About Time, and mainly promoted their lead single, Mandy, to moderate success. Nick, Joe, and Kevin were only 12, 15, and 17 respectively when that album dropped, so they were extremely young, and all they really wanted to do was make music. There's this really old YouTube video I remember watching like on repeat as a kid of just their typical day in the life in New Jersey, and they really did have some truly small, humble beginnings. They also wrote their own music, which consisted of your typical love songs, boy meets girl, boy has a crush on girl, boy wants to marry girl, breakup songs, etc. They were your average small town boy band, and of course the concept was that they were brothers, and they got a lot of comparisons to Hanson because of that. They were also sons of a pastor, so religion was kind of a big factor growing up and definitely influenced the type of music they sang and what lyrics they wrote, at least when they were just starting out. But after being on Disney Channel for some promotions like re-recording Jake Long's theme song and singing Kids of the Future on the Meet the Robinsons soundtrack, Disney saw potential in them and signed them in 2007, and the rest is, well, history. Sold out tours, albums going gold and platinum, their own Disney Channel movie and later a sequel, and by 2008, Jonas Brother Mania was in full swing. I even went on the Wayback Machine, and you can still read some of the comments fans left them, asking like, when are you gonna come to my city, and how much their music has helped them. I also remember watching YouTube a lot back in the day, and even seeing like a Jonas Brother fan getting a tattoo of their old logo on their back, and like that moment just lives in my head rent-free. As Joe wrote in their 2013 Tell All editorial, Disney made us more famous than we ever knew we could be. During concerts, when we'd want to play a new song or have an intimate moment, the screaming could be so overwhelming that we'd have to tell the crowd to calm down and enjoy the moment. It could get scary too. We did a meet and greet in Spain, and like 100,000 people showed up, and we ended up being chased through the shopping mall. It felt like a zombie apocalypse. The Jonas Brothers skyrocketed to fame with help of Disney, but conversely, Disney heavily controlled their image and wouldn't let them grow up with their audience, as they wanted to maintain their clean-cut schoolboy image, which in turn hurt the band's popularity, as well as took out a frustrating psychological toll on the members. By 2009, the Jonas Brothers' popularity was fading, especially with the flop of their third album with Disney's Hollywood Records, Lines, Vines, and Trying Times. Though they still went on a world tour that year, so it wasn't much of a flop as it was just kind of a fizzle. That year, they also had their TV show debut with Jonas, which was also not good. As Joe wrote, I had to shave every day because they wanted me to pretend like I was 16 when I was 20. When the show was done, I cut off my hair and grew as much of a beard as I could. In 2011, they took their hiatus and left Disney. Every generation, has their boy band, and I was glad that for me it was the Jonas Brothers. And looking back, they ended up getting a lot of unnecessary flack for doing nothing. Most of the pushback in the mainstream was because they were too good, too clean-cut. For example, they wore purity rings for a while before finally taking them off because of the intrusive questions people would ask about them. As Joe said on the Late Night Show with James Corden, the funny thing is we were never gonna talk about it. Of course, you have 3 young boys wearing rings on their fingers and everyone is like, are they married already? We were in an interview one day and the guy asked about them, and we said we didn't want to talk about them, and he said, well, I'm just gonna say you're in a cult. The next thing you know was the Jonas Brothers and their purity rings. We decided at one point, look, this is not who we are, this is annoying, people are making fun of it anyway, we can make fun of it ourselves. Even though the rings didn't represent them, it is still annoying to think about how even putting on a clean image can get you in trouble. Back in the day, most people were just waiting for them to crack and follow the broken child celebrity route, but they never really gave anyone that satisfaction. And Joe at least was able to take control of the narrative and speak his truth that he's just a regular guy and was a literal child when suddenly all this fame and fandom was thrust upon him and his brothers. I don't really follow them nowadays, but I think that they're doing pretty well for themselves, all things considered. Next we have my current boy band obsession, EXO. EXO is a K-pop boy band that debuted in 2012 under SM Entertainment. K-pop executive strategy for creating boy bands is if girls love 5 talented and good-looking young men singing and dancing, they're really gonna love 12 men doing the same thing. Though EXO doesn't have 12 members anymore, they debuted with that much, and 4 out of the 12 were actually Chinese, as EXO was originally going to be heavily marketed in China, and even had a Mando-pop subgroup called EXO-M. That didn't pan out very well due to the fact that the Chinese members were not treated very well and couldn't visit their families. 3 of them ended up leaving, the final member Tao leaving in 2015, and now all of them have really solid solo careers in China. Lei, the 4th Chinese member, continues to promote with the group, but from a distance as he has his own solo career in China as well. Member numbers aside, EXO being a K-pop group means that the members went through a rigorous trainee process. The star-making system is still going pretty strong as far as the K-pop industry goes, whereas in the US it's faded out since the early days of Hollywood and later in the 1960s with Motown Records.
The whole Motown system of creating groups of artists was very much a factory processing situation for human beings. Maybe K-pop is South Korea's Motown era.
But it's important to note that it still existed in the US as recently as the 90s with Lou Pearlman's idol-making factory that pumped out both NSYNC and the Backstreet Boys.
One of the things that Lou and we created was a boot camp. So even though NSYNC and Backstreet Boys were a couple of years apart, they went through the same process.
We were working our asses off day in and day out. Lou had these gondola hangars for his airships. No air conditioning in there. It was hot as balls.
We would learn how to dance, we do choreography, and we would learn how to sing on a microphone without being out of breath.
Going back to the SM Entertainment idol-making system, members of EXO had to go through years of training. Leader Suho trained the longest for 6 years, while Chen and Baekhyun had the shortest training periods, being around 4 months.
训练了多长时间? How many years? 저는 약 7년.
大概7年的时间.
7年.苦啊. 아니요. 저도 음악을 정말 좋아했기 때문에. 你们都在骗人.
거짓말이래요. 트레이닝을 너무 좋아해.
你是有请公司的人吃饭吧? 为什么只有你训练了1年就可以出道?
이게 다 멤버들 덕분인 것 같아요. 네. 멤버들이 없었다면 저도 없었겠죠.
No, because your eyes.
And I want to point out that this isn't to say that the K-pop industry is more abusive or worse than other star-making systems around the world or throughout history. Rather, this kind of intense idol-making process has existed in many forms. Even back in the golden days of Hollywood, stars got plastic surgery or went on ridiculous diets because it was demanded by the studio. And the K-pop industry, for the most part, sadly isn't much different. Now let's go on to the anatomy of a K-pop boy band. In most K-pop boy bands, there are assigned leaders, but of course in non-K-pop groups there are also leaders, but I think it's less of a strict distinction. Anyway, the leaders of EXO were Suho and Chris, but after Chris left, Suho was the only leader. Being a leader comes with its own pressures of needing to be the one who talks the most and who takes over during interviews and who makes sure that the group is happy and that things are fair, which is an added pressure K-pop boy bands in particular face.
接下来队长. 네,队长. 저는 你很喜欢当队长哎，我发现.
리더하는 게 좋아하는 것 같아요.
当然. 你肯定喜欢管人. 동생들을 사랑하기 때문에.
And then of course there are the maknaes of the group.
네. 막내 세훈. 안녕하세요. 저는 막내 오세훈이라고 합니다.
되게 장난기도 많고.
South Korea has a hierarchical culture, so it's not uncommon to know someone's age so you know how to address them. Therefore, the youngsters of the group are usually singled out because they're the youngest. This makes Yaja Time an important and fun game to do in reality shows and also just gives everyone their roles. As with most boy bands, Korean or not, members have roles. This one's the goofy one, he's the serious one, he's the athletic one, and in South Korea there are the youngest and oldest as well. Musically, EXO has released 7 studio albums and overall their music is amazing. I'm outing myself as a full EXO stan. Not only is the music catchy, but it's also just musically really well put together. It's important to note that EXO mostly doesn't write their own songs, and mostly are just well-trained performers and employees of SM, but their performances and vocals and dedication to the craft should not be underestimated. They reached their height, I'd say, around 2016 with Monster and in 2017 with Coco Bob, but also had a really strong first few years with Growl and Overdose, and my personal favorite song, Call Me Baby, which came out in 2015. In addition, EXO performed at the closing ceremony in Pyeongchang in 2018. They're still continuing to do really well, but as they get older and as they kind of have to disband a little because of their mandatory military service, it'll probably be a while until we have a full EXO comeback again. But their newest album, Don't Fight the Feeling, which was made with 7 members, was still really good and has some great tracks, specifically Paradise, my favorite song from the album. Unlike the Jonas Brothers, who are under Disney, SM Entertainment lets their groups grow musically. As with EXO, they cover a variety of genres and are always experimenting, but also with their image, as we'll see in the next sections. It's always clean cut, but there's definitely a we're boys who are now men vibe as well. One last band I want to briefly touch on is the last really big non-K-pop boy band I at least still think about, and that is One Direction. One Direction, like the Jonas Brothers and EXO, were formed by executives, particularly Simon Cowell, who was also behind Westlife and later CNCO. Neil McCormick of the Daily Telegraph, in an article on One Direction's success in North America, notes that Americans had left a gap in the market, and it took the prominence of Justin Bieber to demonstrate that there still was a market for clean-cut, wholesome, whiter-than-white, middle-class, parent-friendly cute boys advocating for puppy love. And what could be better than one cute boy, if not 5? And to that, SM Entertainment says, hold my drink. But anyway, from 2010 to 2011, they appeared on The X Factor and were at first auditioning as solo acts, who were then brought together to compete as a band. And though they didn't end up winning the competition, they went on to amass a lot of fame, particularly online. For example, One Direction perfected reaching out to fans via vlogs that the Jonas Brothers also tried to do back in the day. One Direction also fit into the boy band stereotype of each member needing to fit a certain persona. In an approach pioneered by the Beatles, each member was applied a persona. Horan is the cute Irish one, Malik is the quiet and mysterious one, Payne is the mature and sensible one, Styles is the charming flirt, and Tomlinson is the funny and irresponsible one. However, Niall has gone on record saying that they're not your older sister's boy band. Horan commented on One Direction as a boy band. People think that a boy band is air grabs and being dressed all in one color. We're boys in a band. We're trying to do something different from what people would think is the typical kind of boy band. We're trying to do different kinds of music, and we're just trying to be ourselves, not squeaky clean. And I think it was awesome that they got to try to present themselves as regular people rather than fitting into this Disney mold that would only hold them back and later make them resent what they would become. But I also think it's telling how much the term boy band is hated and how much stigma boy bands face that they have to do this to begin with and say, we're boys in a band, but we're not a boy band. I also think that it's kind of sad that being in a boy band comes with all this baggage and unnecessary pressure and expectations when they're literally just teenagers trying to follow their dream. In the end, they all have varying degrees of success as solo artists, and I'm happy for them. I was never a 1D fan, but I liked a lot of their music, and I hope that they continue to find success and maybe even one day make a comeback. So speaking of the X Factor, now that we know what boy bands are, what they're defined by, how they're formed, and the stereotypical image that they're supposed to present to the world, let's dive deeper into the question I posed at the beginning of this video. Why do people, in particular young women and girls, like boy bands? And part of the answer isn't really that deep. They're talented, they're young and attractive, the music usually plays into the typical YA fantasy of I'm your moody yet soft and funny artistic boyfriend, and exploiting that fandom obsession and of course that unique insecurity in teenage girls that the patriarchal society gives them, that they'll never be loved or noticed, equals money. But if it was that simple, this video wouldn't be as long as it is. In my opinion, one of the biggest reasons why boy bands are so popular is because of the underlying or overlying sex factor that they bring to the table, which can be distilled into a few main parts. Their gender performance, the dancing, the lyrics, and the pinnacle of boy bandom, the concert experience. So let's dive into the first aspect of the sex factor, the gender performance. Boy bands mainly cater to a young girl's budding sexuality, as boy bands are mainly defined by their predominantly female audience, though anyone can be a fan of boy bands. But because of this target demographic, boy bands usually take on a less stereotypical or traditionally masculine look. They're usually all clean-shaven, wear schoolboy uniforms or tuxedos, and also wear eyeliner and dye their hair unusual colors, especially in K-pop, which takes the boy band concept and just dials it up to 11. Gender bending, or men wearing makeup for example, is part of the marketing that goes into this YA fantasy aimed at girls because it's less threatening than adult male masculinity. You're not going to sell Magic Mike to kids, especially if you're supposed to imagine that these boys could go to school with you. But I also think it's because in the modern day, gender bending has become tied to being an artist, even though the artists who pioneered these looks, mainly LGBTQ+ artists like Prince, Freddie Mercury, Little Richard, David Bowie, and Elton John, did it as a form of self-expression and to signal to the LGBTQ+ community, as their art wasn't necessarily made for cishet audiences. Little Richard also wore makeup in order to signal to white men that he wasn't going to go after their female partners. As Richard got used to makeup, he ordered his band, the Upsetters, to wear makeup too, to gain entry into predominantly white venues during performances, later stating, "I wore the makeup so that the white men wouldn't think I was after the white girls. It made things easier for me. Plus, it was colorful too." Of course, Little Richard still attracted female fans, and some even threw their undergarments at him while he performed on stage. According to Charles White's biography on the singer entitled The Life and Times of Little Richard, it was the first time that it happened to any artist. And with these artists' mainstream successes, their controversial looks and styles started to become a staple in the music industry, and what it means to be an artist today, even trickling down to boy bands who wear makeup not just to seem less threatening to female audiences, but to look, in my opinion, more like the archetypical musician in modern-day mainstream culture. Though, of course, these aren't the only motivations for gender bending in the music industry today, as some don a certain way of dress and makeup because, like their forebearers, it's part of their identity. In addition, being in an artistic field gives all male musicians a little more leeway to play with the binary. Joe Jonas cites Freddie Mercury, for example, as one of his biggest influences. In a more recent interview with the Jonas Brothers stylist, Yerma Guyan, who dressed them for the Grammys, they said, "Nick wore a gold-foiled Celine jacket, Kevin a Lords and Fools brocade suit, and Joe a Chanel women's wear look. This gender-bending approach to fashion is something the guys have been keen to embrace as of late. Rules are meant to be broken," Yerma Guyan added. And I think that for men in the entertainment industry, that can be really freeing. K-pop also has their own trailblazers whose controversial styles eventually seeped into the mainstream. In David Yi's article, How K-pop Changed the Meaning of Masculinity in South Korea, he writes about Yang Jun-il, who performed My Love Rebecca in 1991 in feminine clothing and makeup, and who was subsequently booed at. Some even threw food at him. He was hated by many for his unusual looks and songs, says an article by the Korea Times. His aesthetics and feminine mannerisms were so controversial, he claims the government refused to renew his visa. Eventually, his career faded away. The 90s K-pop image was the start of K-pop beauty, where teen boy groups wore makeup but not as defined as today's styles, says Young-Hoo Kim, a former music producer for SM Entertainment, one of the top K-pop agencies in the world. It was unheard of for regular men to wear makeup, he says. Today, beauty is a requirement. Kevin Wu describes the makeup he and U-Kiss wore as heavy, with eyeliner, thick with foundation and contouring. When we first debuted, our outfits were very flashy. We wore lots of accessories and sometimes looked like we were straight out of an anime, he said. The trend now is to look like an ideal boyfriend that fans want to date, meaning the look is bright, subtle, and youthful. Emphasis on the last, with the trend being all about bouncy, dewy, teen skin. And that now includes guys who can fantasize about other K-pop male idols. Thanks to K-pop's first openly gay idol, Holland, the 24-year-old singer made international headlines when he came out in 2018. For the solo singer, makeup allowed him to find the courage to become more of himself. "I think true beauty is when my confidence and self-expression is able to show through visually," Holland tells Allure. "Total beauty is achieved by having both inner and outer beauty. Through makeup, I am able to clearly emphasize myself." He goes on to clarify that in Korea, makeup has no gender or sexuality. Makeup is not just for women or necessarily feminine, he explains. It's for everyone. Key from SHINee stated in an Allure interview, "For me, there's no boundary between femininity and masculinity, and I try to be even more natural in my own reactions to people expressing themselves. I modeled for Jill Stewart Accessory Korea. In the photo, I was holding a bag. I didn't want anyone to think, oh, I wish my boyfriend would buy me that bag he's holding. I wanted to look so natural that anyone could say, I love how that bag looks and I want to buy it. I'm wishing for a day when seeing women only wearing men's clothing or this person doing this and this person doing that is completely natural and no one will bat an eye." In Devin Abelman's article, Why Taemin Won't Apologize for His Androgynous Aesthetic Anymore, Taemin, another member of SHINee, says, "As I utilized makeup, I found the increasing need to build my own artistic image. The synergy created from clothing, hair, and makeup combined is truly amazing, so makeup has been, is, and will be a key factor in establishing my identity as an artist." With the release of his recent title track, Want, Taemin knew he wanted his trademark sexy and charismatic yet pure charm to stand out more than ever in the music video and on stage. "I was overall very elegant and androgynous, which might have gained mixed reactions," Taemin notes. "However, I have no regrets about taking risks to express myself and differentiate myself from others as an artist. I think it's great overall how members of boy bands and male singers in general can now, because of the forebears of this movement, can experiment and dress how they want and help other people be seen and discover themselves. On the other hand, I can also see how it can be somewhat cynical that this gender-bending element of the music industry has been used as a marketing tool for profit by larger entertainment companies and with moving designer products, without the companies ever needing to take a stance on LGBTQ+ issues when it's not convenient for them, and even prohibiting some artists from coming out. At the end of the day, gender bending has become part of the mainstream music industry, and though overall a good thing when it comes to freedom of expression and representation, it also can have some more negative consequences. Baiting LGBTQ+ audiences has been discussed when it comes to boy bands, but specifically with the K-pop industry, where the gender-bending aesthetics and touching between members is encouraged by corporations who use it as a form of marketing without, again, ever actually letting any of the members be out, or the companies themselves needing to take a definitive stance on LGBTQ+ issues. It should be noted that skinship or touching between members of the same gender is a cultural norm in South Korea, so it's not necessarily frowned upon for men and women to be physically affectionate with one another, as long as they're just friends and don't identify as LGBTQ+. This guest column from the Korea Times sums up the hypocrisy pretty well. South Korea is not a society that embraces homosexuality yet. Anti-discrimination laws designed to protect people are not sought by the ruling party, and non-heteronormative love is still unfortunately seen as problematic. This was demonstrated by the reaction to Holland's debut music video, Neverland. Holland was one of the industry's first openly gay performers and became a role model for LGBTQ+ fans. However, his video featured him kissing another man and thus received a 19+ rating because it was deemed unsuitable for young viewers. So when the kiss is performative or designed as a feature of the entertainment product, as seen in various K-pop variety shows where members are put in situations where they might accidentally kiss one another, or when directors and choreographers add in parts in shows or music videos where the members touch one another because it makes for clickbaity images, it is acceptable for all ages. When, however, the kiss is one based on love and affection for a member of the same sex, it is seen as corrupting and inappropriate. And this hypocrisy in the K-pop industry of specifically allowing discourse to happen around member sexualities in order to generate clicks without actually letting people express themselves freely or openly is extremely damaging for the fans and for the members and for LGBTQ+ entertainers who face discrimination in an industry that, again, hypocritically uses their identity for profit but would never actually let their employees be out publicly. Corporations know that many fans and non-fans love to spend hours debating someone's sexuality or gender presentation, and that's a huge problem because it just tells these agencies that their strategy of keeping things blurry and as vague as possible without actually saying anything is working. And this, of course, isn't just a problem in K-pop. During One Direction's height in the early and mid-2010s, fans and non-fans speculated and fetishized the relationship between Harry and Louis, which actually led to their relationship being a bit strained. In a 2017 interview with Louis Tomlinson from 1D, he said on the topic of people shipping him and Harry Styles together, "The fear was that fans would overanalyze every minor interaction between the two stars, and it caused them to stay away from one another. It created this atmosphere between the two of us where everyone was looking into everything we did. Louis said candidly. It took away the vibe you get off anyone. It made everything, I think on both fences, a little more unapproachable. At the end of the day, I don't think that we should speculate about anyone's sexuality or think that people are always trying to say something due to the way that they dress or act or present to the world because that's personal. We should just let people present how they want and respect them for it, period. We should also stand behind LGBTQ+ artists because they face a disproportionate amount of discrimination and hate for just being their authentic selves while also having their identities co-opted by media conglomerates for a quick buck. Aside from the gender performance aspect of the sex factor that's used to appeal to a predominantly female audience, there's also the more physically sexual part of the boy band that is heavily used when marketing a male group. And this is where it gets a bit more contradictory. Boy bands, note I'm specifically talking about EXO here, wear makeup and less masculine clothing to seem less intimidating to their mainly female fan base. But on the other hand, also do sometimes extremely sexual dances, especially when they get older. You'd think that because they're marketed as like these cute and soft boys, that their dancing would reflect that, but ironically, it's the opposite. The dances are usually commanding and confident and of course, sexual. Like I said in the previous section, boy bands usually start out with a somewhat innocent concept like suits or school uniforms, but ironically, while wearing those school uniforms, also do some oddly suggestive dances. This later evolves into more mature and overtly sexual concepts as they get older and as their audience grows with them. Visually, there's a lot of crotch grabbing, hip thrusting, pelvic-based dance moves, low camera angles, as well as sexually suggestive costumes that show off their chests and legs. This is mainly more true for EXO's later years, but it was there in their early years too, and also there with American boy bands of the 90s and 2000s, like NSYNC and the Backstreet Boys. With the EXO's Love Shot specifically, there was an emphasis in showing the audience that they're men now and not kids anymore.
이거는 이제 구영이 형이랑 백구영 형이라고 이제 28 막 이런 청년 됐으니까 이제는 노골적으로 가도 된다.
The same concept was pushed with their single Obsession, where they debuted XXO, where they pretend to have evil alter egos to their usually cute EXO personas, and therefore since they were evil, some members exposed more skin. It's important to note that visuals are extremely important with K-pop specifically because a lot of it needs to translate for audiences outside of Korea, and in order to do that, there's a larger emphasis on costuming, makeup, and of course, dancing. In Amy Wong's article, How K-Pop Conquered the West, Christine Ortiz says, a lot of it is very visual. They're able to create a sensory experience through clothes and music videos with elaborate storylines that is not seen in a lot of Western music.
사실 이게 늑대와 미녀 으르렁 할 때 회사에서 전체 투표가 있었어요.
아, 그래요?
어떤 걸 먼저 나와야 되냐. 근데 이수만 선생님 빼고 으르렁이 먼저 나와야 된다 했어요. 모든 전 직원분들. 기억나시죠? 투표했던 거.
아, 진짜?
네, 선생님은 안 된다. 퍼포먼스부터 보여줘야 된다. 선생님 의견을 딱 따랐는데 잘 됐죠.
근데 확실히 근데 말씀하신 것처럼 굉장히 그 무대 퍼포먼스가 너무 기억에 강렬하게 남은 거예요. 그리고 이 생명의 나무 안무도
As Grammy-nominated music producer and K-pop veteran Claude Kelly put it, the pop over there in Korea has always been so Michael Jackson-esque in size. They don't hold back on production and money and rehearsal and stuff. The emphasis on visuals definitely means a lot more sexualization going on of the young male singers and performers, which can get very uncomfortable considering you don't know how much of it they're comfortable with, and how much of it might have been grooming during their years of being a trainee. Men showing their sexual prowess through musical performance has usually been a way for men to signal that they're in power and they're in control. But I think particularly with K-pop, or at least with EXO, it can only be so empowering when you know that they don't have full control over the dances they do or the costumes they wear. However, there are moments where they know what they're doing and even intentionally do fan service. Baekhyun from EXO, who has been called a genius idol, has almost always put on a brave face in front of the camera. He's always, joking or in a happy mood, and he's known for being the goofball of the group. On their EXO Planet tour, he went on a whole monologue about singing in the shower, and it's like, we know what you're doing. And of course, there was his whole Stay Up live stream performance. One of his best songs, by the way. We of course love it, but I think just because he shows this very happy version of himself to the camera that's always laughing or smiling, that doesn't mean that he's like that all the time. And I imagine that it must get pretty tiring being known as the funny one, and then always having to stick to this same act. But you know, I'm only projecting here, like I don't know him in real life, so please don't take this too seriously. And his bubbly personality also doesn't mean that all members of the group feel the same way when it comes to their careers or being in front of the camera, because they definitely don't. I think Baekhyun also has a very different perspective when it comes to being an idol, because he wasn't a trainee for that long, even though he does continue to train his vocals to this day, and also because he debuted at 20 rather than as a teenager, and though of course still young, was still able to have a somewhat regular school life. But just because he seems outwardly okay with being an idol doesn't mean that he inwardly feels that way, or that his happiness should be used to invalidate other people's unhappiness. In all, the level of physicality and the sexual nature of the dances of male K-pop performers, and also of non-K-pop male performers, is something that should be questioned, because as we know, they're not always in control with how they present to the world, and that's not okay. I think a lot of the times the sexualization of male performers gets a pass because they're men or boys and therefore must love sex, but not all men or boys feel that way, especially at such young ages, or when you have to perform your sexuality and come of age in front of thousands of people. Besides the physical sexuality, it's also important to note that the lyrics they sing also have sexual overtones and undertones. Most boy bands, whether they're K-pop boy bands or not, don't always write their own songs. However, some do. The Jonas Brothers, for example, are credited as songwriters on their albums, specifically Nick. But what's more important to note is that no matter who's writing the songs, the categories of the songs are usually all very similar in that they play into a lot of YA girl fantasies. The main types of songs fall under these three general categories. Number 1, I'm a controlling dominant man and you can't help but fall in love with me. Number 2, you're the dominant one and I can't help but fall under your spell. And lastly, number 3, we're best friends and I'm secretly in love with you. For a long time, I didn't look up the English lyrics to K-pop songs because they usually don't really translate well in English, and I think that's fine because you can still enjoy music or a song without knowing the lyrics, but I recently looked them up, and some of them are really intense. One of my favorite EXO songs, Monster, has these lyrics. I'm creeping in your heart, babe, I'll flip you over, break you down and swallow you up, I'll steal you and indulge in you, I'm gonna mess you up, I'm engraved in your heart, so even if I die, I'll live forever. This of course falls into the first category of dominant man song. And honestly, I don't find this to be too problematic. It's just a YA fantasy and a power dynamic that I think naturally a lot of young girls and young people in general find fascinating. We shouldn't moralize girls for being into boy bands, and we shouldn't make out boy bands as role models, but I do sometimes wonder what the men singing these songs think of the lyrics. They do lampshade the lyrics sometimes, like in this interview with Baekhyun when talking about their single Wolf, which is inspired by Beauty and the Beast, another typical YA fantasy directed at women that girls usually take an interest in.
소개하죠. 그래 울프, 나는 울프. 널 한 입에 치즈처럼 잡아놓을 테다.
그냥 한 입거리뿐이라고.
아니 이거 솔직히 이거 컨셉이랑 가사 처음 봤을 때 어떠셨어요?
엑소 잘 돼야 되는데.
Taemin's criminal music video and lyrics are also pretty interesting. I love the song, by the way, and it falls into the second category, which is I'm crazy for you even though you hurt me. The song has these distinctive lyrics, destroy me more and I'm on a leash called you. The music video also contains a popular visual concept for male idol songs, which is abused man. They usually wear makeup that shows that they've been beaten up or hurt because they're either fighting for you or being destroyed by you, specifically again in Taemin's Criminal, which touches on some themes of abuse. It's a really fine line that they're walking on, and I don't know if it's necessarily like a bad idea as far as aesthetics go, but it's definitely a concept. But Taemin's Criminal isn't, of course, the only song that has this theme of "you're making me go crazy." It's in the Jonas Brothers discography as well, with songs like Still in Love with You and Got Me Going Crazy. Not to mention that the Super M song Tiger Inside has a lyric that says "don't tie me up," but when you listen to the song, all you hear is them asking you to tie them up. Don't tie me up, tie me. I think the concept of you, the presumed girl protag of the song, having the power in the relationship isn't too bad, because I think it's there to help girls with self-esteem issues by making them feel beautiful enough or powerful enough to bring a man to his knees. It's overall an interesting concept, again, to say the least, but I definitely think that sometimes it can get pretty intense, especially like when you have themes of abuse involved and when the music video shows a man being suffocated with a plastic bag. You know, that needs to be handled with care. I like the song again, and Taemin, of course, is an incredibly talented and dedicated artist. But I'm just saying that it's a choice, and one that didn't get a lot of backlash, which again is fine. But I do think that it's odd how this song didn't get that much backlash for depicting abuse. But when Blackpink's Kill This Love came out, everyone was moralizing them for promoting domestic violence. And it's like, if you're gonna be mad at that, then you also kind of should be mad at this too. The last category of boy band song that I want to touch on, and that I do find a little bit problematic, is "I'm Your Best Friend, But I'm Also Secretly in Love With You." The Jonas Brothers in particular have a song called Just Friends, which was honestly my jam back in the day, but nowadays it's kind of odd. The lyrics go, "Falling in love, just you and me till the end of time, till I'm on her mind it'll happen. I've been making lots of plans, like a picket fence and a rose garden. I just keep on dreaming, but it's cool because we're just friends." It definitely falls into a pretty natural YA girl fantasy of maybe the boy I like is secretly in love with me, and it fits really well into this whole thing from Disney, especially in the early 2000s, where they had like the boy and girl friend characters always become more than just friends. But honestly, I do find this kind of annoying, because just because you're friends with a guy doesn't mean that you need to fall in love with them, or that they're secretly in love with you. I think it can definitely add to the confusion rather than help it, but like I said, as a kid, I did really like this song, but nowadays it's just kinda cringy. The lyrics of boy band songs are usually highly critiqued because of the bad messages they're sending to young impressionable female audiences, but I don't find them in general to be too insidious, depending on the depiction of the subject matter, because a lot of them are just typical YA fantasies that don't necessarily carry that much weight to them. And again, boy bands aren't role models, they're celebrities, and girls can think for themselves and are smarter than you think. One song that critiques the sex or romantic factor when it comes to boy bands and their lyrics, but particularly makes fun of Justin Bieber and One Direction, was Bo Burnham's song Repeat Stuff. And though I liked it at the time, as Bo Burnham was a big part of my not like other girls phase, nowadays it just kind of makes me really angry. And this song is from 2013, so he himself I'm sure is a different person, and I did watch Inside, and he clearly is a very self-reflective human being, but back in the early 2010s this song resonated with a lot of people, but I think for the wrong reasons, mainly because it is sung down to girls and women. As the song goes, I love the fact that you're dumb enough to not realize that everything I've said has been said before in 1,000 ways in 1,000 songs, some with the same 4 chords. Oh girl, I hope you don't think that I'm rude when I tell you that I love you, boo. I also hope that you don't see through this cleverly constructed ruse designed by a marketing team cashing in on puberty and low self-esteem and a girl's desperate need to feel loved. So the song is clearly sung from Bo's sleazy male pop singer's persona, who calls his female fans dumb for not being able to realize that his image is just a cleverly constructed ruse, and that everything he's saying has been said before, and that he's not a real artist. And it's like, first of all, stop demeaning young women for liking boy bands and male singers, and also most teenagers do grow up and realize that it is a constructed ruse, but that doesn't mean that they should stop liking it, and that also doesn't make them dumb. Why mock people for being into things that they're told to be into or that help them get through some hard stuff in life? And why do you feel the need to insert yourself in this conversation to begin with? Also, some people really just do like the music, and it's not because they're brainwashed, it's because the music sometimes is just really good, and people aren't, again, dumb for liking it. A lot of boy bands and their music get flack, specifically because of the way their fans, usually teenage girls, are seen, mainly as being mindless and frivolous, so therefore the music they like must also be crappy. And yeah, maybe the lyrics aren't like the deepest thing you're ever gonna hear in your whole life, but if you expect them to be, maybe you should do some self-reflection. I think a lot of people liked this song back then because it was when Justin Bieber was doing some, not good things. He's clearly not a perfect dude, but don't you realize that he's also a young male entertainer who got famous off of YouTube, who was also thrusted into the spotlight at a young age, just like you? And this, of course, isn't to give Justin Bieber, a pass, because no, but have some type of self-awareness. Also, Bo Burnham has written songs about how hard it is to be an artist in the entertainment industry, so it's odd, to me at least, how he doesn't empathize with other young male singers and also feels the need to attack their fan base. And again, I'm not here to dunk on Bo for a song that he wrote almost a decade ago, but at the same time, it's weird to me just how he has so much to say about teenage girls being possessed by these male singers, as if he needs to wake them up. We know, dude, just calm down.
Whoa, just take it easy, man.
And I think that since being into boy bands is one of the main acceptable interests for young girls as far as expressing their sexuality or interest in men goes, I think that it's really shitty how we try to moralize that because the lyrics are bad. The final element of the sex factor when it comes to boy bands, in my opinion, is the live concert experience or the show experience, where everything for a male pop group comes together at once. The costuming, the dancing, the lyrics, and of course, the screaming fans. I like to think of boy band concerts a lot like musical theater or even like going to a sports game. It's a place where you can lose yourself in the shamelessness of your interest and immerse yourself in the experience of seeing your favorite people live with a whole crowd that feels the same intense feelings you do. At EXO concerts specifically, since EXO is such a high concept band in that they have an origin story and superpowers, don't ask. There's a lot of theatrics and money put into the visuals when they perform, and it really pays off. And it's at these concert performances where we can see EXO in particular come to life and really see all of their years of training at work. In the concert DVDs, as well as in the live show performances, you can see how well perfected each of their facial expressions are and how well they know their angles. Kai especially has gotten his smirk down to a science, and it is deadly. Kai is the second youngest member of EXO and debuted when he was just 18, but he went through 5 years of training before that, as well as took ballet and dance classes since he was a kid. And it's kind of obvious, at least to me, that he's been prepped to be the male lead visual of EXO since his trainee years. He's always in the center, has solo dance performances as he's the principal dancer, and is always shown within the first few seconds of any live show or music video. His dedication shows, though sometimes it's hard to watch him go through the motions of some of their songs and see him get more and more tired and sweaty with each breath. Sometimes they look so exhausted on stage but are still doing their signature facial movements and hip thrusts that it's kind of uncomfortable because you can just tell how overworked they are. What's even odder is when they have to lift up their shirts, but at the same time they work so hard to maintain their abs and physique. It's like, yeah, show them off. Most of the time when they're not performing, they're usually wearing baggy clothes or big t-shirts and suits where they're covered from their neck to their ankle, while at the same time ironically being on diets and trying to lose weight or maintain their abs for a future performance or promotion. They do all this work to show their abs for maybe a few minutes, so maybe it is nice to kind of get at least some validation for all the hard work they do to maintain them. But it must be really hard to have a good relationship with your body or with food when your body isn't really yours. Anyway, concerts are just a really emotional experience for both the groups and the fans watching. They cry together, laugh together, and it's a moment where the fans can enjoy the group while also not invading the group's privacy or harassing them for photos and autographs. I think what's interesting is that when you see them on stage or in a music video, it really makes you think that they're these otherworldly, perfect human beings, but in the end, they are just regular people, and I think that's what the concerts try to bridge, and I think that they do a good job of that. I think it's pretty obvious that boy bands have to do a lot, that it's sometimes uncomfortable and awkward as an audience member to watch. From singing songs that have strangely suggestive lyrics from a young age, from doing dances that are inherently sexual to sculpting their body in a way to fulfill someone else's fantasy. It's a lot, and I don't think many people really think about how, because we see men as innately more sexual than women, we let a lot of the things that aren't okay or that should be questioned slide. The idea that men always want sex or want girls, or that men showing sexual dominance on stage means that they're in power, makes us dehumanize them. At the end of the day, boy band members are just regular dudes, and it can be surprising and jarring to see how normal they are compared to how they look on stage. I know I was personally surprised when I saw my first EXO interview, and they were just normal people with distinct personalities. And it can be really hard to be a celebrity when your brand is that you need to kind of be like this blank canvas for an audience to project onto and to fantasize about, but you also need to have a personality, and that persona might not live up to people's expectations. Joe talked about just being a regular kid in his tell-all editorial, writing, "I was caught drinking when I was 16 or 17, and I thought the world was going to collapse. But I was in another country and it was legal there. On my 21st birthday, I fell down a flight of stairs. I was unconscious at the time. My whole team was so scared to death that somebody was going to get a picture." Joe also talked about how they did weed and drank and cursed and hated their good boy image because it was confining to be a good role model when you yourself are still just a kid. Celebrities, in particular young male entertainers, aren't role models, and it's kind of annoying how we treat them like that because that's what makes them lash out, because everyone's expecting them to crack because that's just how child stars are, right? When in reality, people lash out because of the absurd amount of pressure on them to be someone they're not. In the end, we have to bear in mind that celebrities are just regular people. Yes, they have a big following and influence and should be responsible with that power, but a lot of the power that they have isn't necessarily always theirs to control.
K-pop invades the East Bay.
It's pretty amazing, Jessica. Look behind me at this line of enthusiastic young people.
It's like the Beatles sensation all over again.
There's been a lot of talk recently, specifically because of BTS's Rolling Stone cover, about how K-pop in general, but specifically K-pop boy bands, seem to be thriving, contradictory to how things are going on in the US when it comes to boy bands, which I guess isn't great. Honestly, I don't follow boy bands from the US, but I think I can say that there aren't many huge ones, at least that I know of. And this brings me back to my first K-pop video where I talked about how the why K-pop question kind of comes off as a backhanded compliment. People in the US, for example, need some grand explanation as to why K-pop is working, because it's foreign and not in English, and because since the US sees itself as #1 and the default and the blueprint for music, they're just so baffled that they're not the future of music or whatever. And I think that white people specifically aren't happy that these Asian men are getting so popular. Not only are they afraid due to their race, but because of K-pop's specific way of blurring gender lines, as we talked about before in this video. K-pop threatens traditional white male masculinity, and honestly, good. But if we are really going to answer this question of why K-pop and take it seriously, it's really not that hard to understand. Firstly, K-pop is based on Black American music, mainly hip-hop and R&B, renowned genres that foreign listeners outside of South Korea are familiar with. Lee Soo-man of SM Entertainment has said this, as well as Bang Si-hyuk, who's behind acts like BTS. As Bang Si-hyuk said, "Upon this, we added BTS's unique value along with hip-hop and black music. The members like hip-hop and black music. These two things lowered the entry barrier to Western markets. K-pop is unfamiliar to Westerners, but they are familiar with hip-hop and black music." I talked about this a lot in my last K-pop video, so I'm not going to get too deep into it here, but there are tons of black music producers working in K-pop, like Keela Jacobson, Claude Kelly, Adrian McKinnon, Rodney Chick Bell, and more. Many hip-hop and R&B veterans are currently working in the South Korean entertainment industry, and in this article, How American R&B Songwriters Found a New Home in K-pop by Elias Late, Claude Kelly says, "America is responsible for inventing R&B and especially the 1990s R&B and hip-hop fusion. We're having this thing now where we are literally being reintroduced to our own stuff. K-pop acts are like, hey, this is the shit that you did that was dope, and we still love it." Songwriting camps in South Korea share some characteristics with camps in the US. "Our goal is to still write the best song possible," Rodney Chick Bell says, but writers employ a wider array of tools. Priscilla Renea, Rihanna Mary J. Blige, the K-pop girl group Girls' Generation, says she often faces frustration in American sessions. "We'll listen to R&B in the studio and get inspired, like, turn it on, that's dope," she explains. "Then when it comes time to making something, the chords become less colorful. there's less movement, the beat becomes really basic. But in South Korea, the music producers get a lot more freedom, and like Kelly said, are reintroduced to their own stuff. Chick has said previously that the average American song is 4 melodies, maybe 5. The average K-pop song is 8 to 10. They're also very heavy in the harmonies. So there's the first reason why K-pop is thriving in the American music market. It has recruited Black American producers who are experts in the main genres that K-pop is based on, but has turned the dial again up to 11 and has made K-pop, and more specifically Korean hip-hop, distinctive enough to feel brand new. Before we move on from the musical element of why K-pop, it would be remiss to not talk about the strategically placed English lyrics in order to rope in that foreign audience, but specifically English speakers.
Hey there, don't move. Can I be your boyfriend? Can I? Know something. Call me baby, call me baby. You call me, monster. We're going crazy, my lucky lady.
The second reason is because there's still a hunger for boy bands that the K-pop industry just feels better than the American boy band industry. What's better than 5 handsome guys singing about how they want to be your boyfriend? 12 handsome boys singing about how they want to be your boyfriend. And though I think many people assume that 12 is too many members to keep track of, it's really not. And it actually makes me and other people just more amazed at how many people can perfectly dance in sync, and it also leads to bigger musical spectacles. A lot of the time, I prefer watching the live performances as opposed to the music videos because of how cool it looks to see that many people dance and sing and act in just one take. Another reason why I think K-pop boy bands do better is because, like I've mentioned before, SM Entertainment has at least let EXO specifically grow with their audience, unlike Disney with the Jonas Brothers, who couldn't do that because Disney is a kid-friendly brand. But it's important to note that growing as a K-pop boy band, at least in regards to EXO, usually just means that you're going to be sexualized a lot more. On the upside, K-pop idols can openly drink and they don't need to try to hide that part of themselves, whereas with Disney, it's a big taboo because most of their stars are underage. While EXO says in their song Power, "We take shots, we take shots." So I guess it could be more freeing in that sense, but it is also kind of more restrictive when it comes to being publicly allowed to date, for example. They're allowed to grow, but only in a way that is profitable for the brand. EXO perfectly toes that line of teen to young adult content where the members are grown enough, but not explicitly so or in a way that would ever be detrimental to the bottom line. That, I think, Disney has yet to master, and honestly, will never master because, again, kid-friendly image. Another part of what makes K-pop boy bands inherently more interesting is the discovery aspect. As Christine Ortiz said in Amy Wong's article, How K-pop Conquered the West, in the US it's a process of self-discovery, and that makes it really exciting for fans. Users find one song and they start digging on their own. There's a level of motivation and socialization you don't see with American artists. Some fans, she says, even wind up learning Korean as a result. The novelty of K-pop and how K-pop is fueled by the internet makes it really special, at least to me, and I think to a lot of others. You start to feel more of an ownership over your band when you're the one that found it one day rather than it being marketed directly at you through Disney Channel, for example. In addition, I like K-pop because of the Asian representation. I think it's cool to see Asian people being successful and beautiful and talented. And I think it also might help defamiliarize people and make non-Asian people see Asian people, specifically men, in a more fair light. But at the same time, it might also reinforce negative notions that non-Asian people already have about Asian men. But for me as an Asian American fan, that's another reason why I like K-pop and why I think a lot of other people gravitate towards it. Because there's so little Asian representation in the US, and so we have to go out of our way to find it. Of course, this also sometimes leads to racial fetishization of the band members, which is meh and definitely happens, and all I can say to that is, please don't. So honestly, the answer to why K-pop or why K-pop boy bands specifically isn't that hard to parse out. K-pop music is catchy, familiar, yet innovative. You feel a special sense of closeness to the band that you discovered and that wasn't shoved down your throat by Disney, for example. And because it's cool to see Asian people break up the monotony of white boy bands. And whether purposefully or not, defy gender norms and racial expectations of what a boy band needs to look like. And to just add another nail in the coffin, there's just so much content when it comes to K-pop boy bands that it really is just a treasure trove for any fan. The amount of video footage alone that comes out of a single music video is amazing. There's fan cams, there's 5 different music shows, there's behind the scenes clips, there's vlogs, reality shows, and live streams. It simply cannot be matched.
They all were kind of like without dads, so Lou kind of filled that void.
Kevin really looked up to Lou as a father figure. We called him Big Papa.
Lou was head of our family. We would have dinners, we would tell him everything.
It's just like Peter Pan and the Lost Boys.
I think it's because, you know, he didn't have a lot of family.
Though we've touched on some heavier topics throughout this video when it comes to boy bands and being a celebrity, now we're really going to dive in. Firstly, I want to talk about parasocial relationships or one-sided relationships with public personas, be it a celebrity or an internet creator, where you know that they exist, but they don't know that you exist. Parasocial relationships don't necessarily need to be a bad thing. A lot of the time they can be really healthy, and you liking a public figure and supporting them online in a respectful way throughout their public career can be a nice form of self-expression. I've definitely been in parasocial relationships before where I admire someone's work and follow them online, but would never want to meet them in real life. But of course, there are the downsides of having parasocial relationships, mainly when you're a celebrity who needs to be seen as likable and available to your fans in order to please them, because you wouldn't be where you are without them. Obsessive fans and stalking, specifically when it comes to K-pop, can get really bad. So much so that EXO doesn't really have meet and greets anymore because of how misbehaved the fans can get. Chenyol has spoken out about how the fans stalked and harassed him and chased him at the airport, along with Baekhyun, who's been stalked back to his apartment. Joe Jonas even talked about how girls would show up in his room and how he would have to call security. There were moments when I'd walk into my hotel room only to find a girl I didn't know standing there. For the record, we didn't have the traditional rock and roll experience. We were kids working with Disney, so finding a girl in our hotel room didn't feel like an open invitation. It felt like a problem that we had to solve without it getting us in trouble. There was this one time in South America where a hotel staff member snuck his kid into my room. I don't know what they were hoping would happen, but security showed her out. There definitely starts to become a point where it's okay to resent your fans for their behavior, whether it's because of obsessive fans or just casual fans. Not being able to go out in public without getting harassed or even feeling safe in your own hotel or apartment can make you extremely irritated. Chen from EXO recently got married and had a baby, and some fans were demanding his resignation from EXO and even sending boxes of cut-up merch back to SM Entertainment. The company and band stands behind Chen, which is nice, but that's just an example of how bad parasocial relationships can get when people feel that they should have ownership over you and your career because they made you. Sure, no one would be famous or successful without their fans, but at the same time, EXO's success, for example, or any boy band success, also comes from their hard work and their dedication to the craft, not just the fans. But there's a lot of emphasis on pleasing the fans that I've specifically seen with EXO. They're always trying to make the fans, feel like part of the group and thank them because they wouldn't be here without them. Which I think they do because it's a nice thing to do and they really truly believe that, but also out of obligation and maybe fear of what would happen if they didn't thank the fans. Another thing that I think is important to highlight is the lack of recognition and respect for child labor laws and how young men and boys specifically are exploited as children. And though no K-pop star I follow has ever publicly talked about this, specifically EXO members, Chris, Luhan, and Tao of EXO did speak about how horrible the trainee process was and how they cried during rehearsals. Luhan particularly remembered Tao struggling during one of their dance classes. When he first came to where we were training, he left in the middle of our wild party dance class. After I found him, he was crying. He felt too much pressure. He was crying in the restroom. He's the best in tear glands, Chris teased. Because I only had 2 things back then that I needed to do, which was dancing and singing. I put a lot of pressure on myself. I didn't know anything back then. Every day I think that we should just perform well. I had a one-track mind. That's it. I didn't think about anything else. After EXO won their first music show with Wolf, Almost all of the members broke down crying because of how strenuous it must have been to get to that point, specifically for Suho, who trained for an extremely long time, and for the Chinese members who were finally getting their big break after being away from their home country and family for so long. I watched all of EXO Showtime for this video, which is one of EXO's first reality shows, and I think one of the only reality shows with all 12 members. And some of the members just looked so angry and tired in that show, or even just kind of fed up, mainly due to the fact that they're already overworked due to their music show promotions and rehearsals, and now they have to record a reality show. And yeah, it's a reality show, which means none of it is actually real, and it's all definitely staged, but it's hard to edit like how unhappy some people look in it, specifically in the episode where they have to be locked in different karaoke rooms and couldn't leave them until they all answered one of the questions the right way. There was even another episode where they had to go to like this haunted house, and Tao really wasn't having it, and I felt so bad for him. They even had one weird episode where they had to watch like a sad movie because then the fans would be able to see them cry, and it was just weird. In a more recent reality show, Mtopia, that showcases Super M, Taemin didn't want to do the wakeboarding challenge, and thankfully, no one actually made him do it, showing that things might have gotten better in the reality show circuit. Maybe. Going back to EXO Showtime, there's a narrative in the show that Chris, an ex-member of the band, ends up turning around from being a cool guy to a soft guy, but he still looks like freaking pissed at the end, honestly. Now I specifically want to talk about Kai and Taemin, who were both really young when they started their careers at SM Entertainment. I think that they were around 13 or 14 at the time. I'm projecting, so keep that in mind, but I think they specifically were prepped and trained even harder than the other members because they were so young when they started training together, and after training, Kai at least became the center visual for EXO, and of course, like I said earlier, the principal dancer. In all of their early promotions, specifically for Overdose, Mama, and Call Me Baby, Kai is always in the center and shown as one of the first members on screen. He's been working for more than half of his life, and I'm sure it's impossible to even describe how draining but also fulfilling it must be, specifically with how good his mini album turned out. Like, it's really good. And of course, Taemin and Kai both ended up in Super M together, which is Lee Soo-man's passion project, Lee Soo-man again being the CEO and founder of SM Entertainment. Super M is the Avengers of boy bands in that they're made up of already popular SM Entertainment acts. SM partnered with Capitol Music Group based in LA together and produced Super M, a male K-pop group specifically marketed to US audiences. They were even on an episode of All That on Nickelodeon. Lee Soo-man is in most of the behind-the-scenes footage giving his directorial input. He was at the screening of Jopping in LA. He's mentioned a lot by most of the members of his company in interviews and in award acceptance speeches, and it's just the patriarchal figure. And he seems honestly well-meaning enough, though of course he's gotten into some tax evasion stuff and was even wanted by Interpol at some point. But as Key said in an interview, just because the groups are successful and liked by the CEO doesn't mean that they move up in the company or even hold any real power. He says that Growl, EXO's breakthrough hit, built the building they're in, and though of course it's a joke, like all jokes, there's some truth to it. He later adds that if they were at a smaller company or not an entertainment company at all, the members of EXO would be board members at this point, not employees. To talk about another patriarchal figure who has a well-documented history of abuse, I highly suggest watching the Lou Pearlman doc here on YouTube. The members of Lou Pearlman's groups, which include NSYNC and the Backstreet Boys, talk about how they later had to sue him to get control over their music. Lou Pearlman implemented a similar idol-making process to that of the K-pop industry. He had the trainees live together, practice together, and wait to be debuted together. They put up with all this because they were groomed by him. He made them think that he was their friend and had their best interest at heart. He was even like some of their father figures, as he predominantly preyed upon low-income, single-parent homes, as they would be the ones more desperate for this opportunity. Abusers choose their victims, and he chose very carefully. The documentary gets into this in more detail about what he did to them physically and verbally, which I'm not going to talk about here, but if you want to know more, go check it out. In the end, after NSYNC went on their promotions and were finally going to receive their first check after a year of non-stop touring, working, selling out stadiums, and having multiple #1 hits, they got $10,000. And this was after Lou built up the checks to be a big thing that they were excited to get. They ended up suing Lou and won, and in the end debuted one of their best albums to date, No Strings Attached, with their lead single, Bye Bye Bye, dedicated to none other than Lou Pearlman. Pearlman, though a huge threat to a lot of kids, and who had an even bigger Ponzi scheme cooking up in the background, did end up being taken down and ending up in jail. Some justice was served, but his victims will never get the parts of their lives that he took away from them. There's definitely a dismissal of a lot of abuse that kids celebrities and young adult celebrities face because they're living the dream, when in reality as a kid or young person you don't really have any idea what fame will bring or what fame is. You can't consent to being bossed around or handled by adults who don't always have your best interest at heart, and that's scary. And who should be held accountable are the government systems in place to protect children in the entertainment industry, but they so seldom are.
No one is around you. Say, baby, I love you. You ain't running game. Say my name, say my name. I'll tell you what I want, what I really, really want. So tell me what you want, what you really, really want. Listen, boy. We are the lost singers. Should've left your ass from time ago. Didn't love me then, but now I do.
So as we observed in this video, boy bands are extremely lucrative, sometimes for decades. But what about girl groups? Girl groups are definitely a force to be reckoned with. From the Spice Girls to Destiny's Child to Little Mix to Blackpink, they have proved time and time again that they have just as much staying power as male groups. But I think that the male-dominated entertainment industry still just sees boy groups as a safer bet because they just need that big fandom. And that demographic that brings about a boy band's success is just seen as a more surefire bet monetarily. Men in general are seen as more universally likable, more likely to be given a pass for their mistakes, and only get better with age, whereas women are a tougher sell because they aren't universally liked, and in fact get worse with age, and have a shorter shelf life when it comes to the entertainment industry specifically. Women have to appeal to more than just that niche demographic that boys do. They need to have that mass market appeal, and though possible to obtain, is still really hard to do when women are charged with being the moral centers of society, but also are told that sex sells. But when they do come out as sexy or sexual, they're immediately shamed for it. Like always, there's no winning. Women are also more highly judged on appearances than men are, so the beauty standard is also different. Jessie Nelson of Little Mix actually left the band after being classified as the ugly one for so long, and talked about how that took a terrible toll on her mental health. She said in May of this year to Cosmopolitan, "I was bigger than the other three, and there's never really been that in a girl group," Nelson told Cosmopolitan. "I was classified as the obese one, the fat one. Looking back," she said, "I can't believe how miserable I was." Thankfully, she was able to leave and live her life on her own terms, but she shouldn't have had to be subjected to that in the first place. And it doesn't just stop there. When you look up Blackpink on Google, one of the most asked questions is, who is the ugliest member? In addition to it just being harder for female entertainers due to working in a male-dominated field and industry, it's also harder to please young girl fans who might resent a group if they're not relatable enough. Teen girls are a huge market that are ready to support both girl and boy groups, but it's harder to market a girl group because some young girls who already feel insecure about themselves might just start to resent a group of stereotypically beautiful women. As seen with the harassment that Jessie Nelson faced and that even Britney Spears faced back in the day, there's a lot of girl-on-girl hate because women are set out to compete against one another and judge one another to the nth degree. So therefore, it's really hard to get into that young teen girl demographic if you're not able to be relatable, which is something that I don't think men face as much. Especially since we like to fantasize about how the men in boy bands are not like other men, but we want girls to be just like us or to be able to see them as our friend. I think that's one reason why female singers who market themselves against what men stereotypically find attractive tend to have bigger followings, like Billie Eilish, Rina Sawayama, and even Taylor Swift, for example. Taylor Swift specifically was marketed back in the day as the dorky best friend that could be your best friend, and because of that, didn't alienate her female demographic. But it's annoying that women in the entertainment industry have to differentiate themselves by being not like other girls, and therefore they can't be too girly or too stereotypically feminine without facing backlash because they're brainwashed or slutty or whatever, when they're just being themselves. Taylor Swift, who though has a strong female fan base and was able to be relatable, still faced backlash for singing songs about boys, and it's like... Even today, Olivia Rodrigo had to respond to sexist criticisms of her work just because she sings about boys, and it's like, shut up. Next, of course, there's the sex factor. When it comes to the sex factor, men's sexuality is seen as powerful, at least on a surface level, whereas for women, it makes them be seen as whores. Which is why women who are unabashedly sexual and own it are dominating the music industry. But still, with girl groups, there's always going to be that moral element, don't sing about boys because that's not empowering, and that age element, as women tend to have shorter careers than women in show business because by the time you're 28, you're already seen as too old. Most of the time, we give men space to age gracefully, whereas with women, we constantly want to infantilize them and never let them grow up into women because we see older or middle-aged women as gross. Some women, of course, have defied this, but still do their best to retain their youthful appearance because they know what will happen to them if they don't. Men, of course, have to retain their looks as well, and there is mounting pressure on men to stay young and beautiful, but there is still a significant difference to how women and men are treated in the entertainment industry, and that cannot be overlooked. Some girls like your stereotypical pop boy bands, some girls like emo boy bands, some girls like punk boy bands, some girls like R&B boy bands, some girls like alternative rock boy bands, and some girls don't like boy bands at all. The boy band phenomenon covers so many genres that basically you can just pick and choose one to get into, and I think that's kind of awesome because the sheer differentiation of boy bands shows how different girls' interests are from one another. In this video, I've only posed a few hypotheses as to why boy bands have become a cultural phenomena, and in many ways, it's not that deep. The answers are rooted in male privilege, but also in the buying power of teenage girls, and just that talent plus beauty equals money. But we shouldn't stop there when talking about boy bands because that only adds to the overly reductive narrative that boy bands need to combat. They get this absurd reputation for not being that deep, and rather than just accepting that, we should ask why that is. And the deeper answer is because of sexism towards their main fan demographic, because everything that teen girls and women like is shitty apparently, and because of that, the boy bands that they uphold are seen as the worst thing about the music industry because they're not real artists and are just cash grabs. And though, yes, they are cash grabs to an extent, that doesn't mean that their work is invalid. Sure, some songs aren't high art, but it's still good in its own right. I love boy bands, and they will forever fascinate me, and it's annoying how boy bands have become a point of moral contention simply because young girls find them attractive and like their music. Anyway, too long didn't watch, I like boy bands. Let me know what your favorite boy band is in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and thank you to my patrons and members. Bye.